The old barn creaked in the mountain wind, its weathered wood groaning like ancient bones. Through a crack in the door, golden sunlight illuminated two figures sitting close together on a hay bale, their hands intertwined despite the scars that marked both their skin. The woman's voice was barely a whisper as she traced the deep lines across the man's massive palm. "I used to think broken meant worthless," she said, her eyes glistening with tears that caught the light like diamonds. "But you taught me that sometimes the most beautiful things come from pieces that have been shattered and carefully put back together." The gentle giant beside her, his shoulders broad enough to carry the world's sorrows, smiled with a tenderness that transformed his battle-worn face. "Maya, my love," he rumbled in a voice like distant thunder, "broken things don't just fit together. They create something stronger than either piece ever was alone." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Colorado mountains stretched endlessly toward the horizon, their peaks crowned with snow that never fully melted, even in the height of summer. Pine Valley nestled in a valley between these giants, a town that had seen better days but stubbornly refused to surrender to time and economic hardship. Here, where cell phone service was spotty and the nearest shopping mall was 3 hours away, people still believed in handshake deals and helping neighbors through tough times. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like a protective blanket, slowly lifting to reveal the patchwork of struggling ranches and abandoned homesteads that dotted the landscape. Some properties had been in families for generations, passed down through bloodlines that stretched back to the original settlers. Others stood empty, their windows dark and their fields returning to wild grass, silent monuments to dreams that couldn't survive the harsh realities of modern ranching. Maya Thompson had awakened before dawn, as she did every morning, not by choice but by necessity. The nightmares that had plagued her sleep for the past 2 years never seemed to respect normal hours, dragging her from restless slumber with images that her conscious mind fought desperately to forget. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the tiny apartment above Mountain View Cafe, watching the sun paint the distant peaks in shades of rose and gold. At 22, Maya possessed a fragile beauty that spoke of someone who had seen too much too soon. Her auburn hair fell in waves around a face that would have been stunning if not for the haunted quality in her green eyes, the way she held herself as if expecting another blow to fall at any moment. Her hands, once smooth and unmarked, now bore the silver lines of scars that told stories she refused to share with anyone in Pine Valley. The apartment was sparse, containing only the bare necessities that the cafe's owner, Mrs. Patterson, had provided when she offered Maya the job 6 months ago. A bed, a small dresser, a hot plate, and a mini refrigerator comprised the entire living space. Maya owned little beyond a few changes of clothes and a battered leather journal that she kept hidden beneath her mattress, its pages filled with words she could never speak aloud. The sound of delivery trucks rumbling down Main Street signaled the beginning of another day in Pine Valley. Maya moved through her morning routine with mechanical precision, showering quickly in the shared bathroom at the end of the hall, then dressing in the simple uniform required for her job at the cafe. The work was honest and kept her busy enough that her mind couldn't wander too far into dangerous territory, though the constant interaction with customers left her emotionally drained by the end of each shift. Maya had arrived in Pine Valley with nothing but the clothes on her back and a bus ticket that had taken her as far from her past as the last of her money could manage. Mrs. Patterson, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and an intuitive understanding of when not to ask questions, had taken one look at the trembling young woman who stumbled into her cafe that rainy evening and offered her both a job and a place to stay. The work at Mountain View Cafe was exactly what Maya needed. Demanding but not overwhelming, busy enough to keep her thoughts occupied, but predictable enough that she never felt truly threatened. She served coffee to ranchers discussing cattle prices, listened to local gossips share the latest news about who was dating whom, and watched families celebrate small milestones over plates of Mrs. Patterson's famous apple pie. Yet despite the kindness of her employer and the general warmth of the small community, Maya remained largely isolated. She spoke when spoken to, smiled when expected, and performed her duties with quiet efficiency, but she never lingered for conversations or accepted invitations to local social gatherings. The other young people in town had initially tried to include her, sensing a kindred spirit who might understand the challenges of small-town life. But Maya's polite rejections had eventually discouraged their efforts. The truth was that Maya felt fundamentally damaged, as if the trauma that had driven her to Pine Valley had left invisible wounds that made her unfit for normal human connections. She believed that her past had marked her in ways that couldn't be healed, that anyone who truly knew her story would recoil in horror, or worse, look at her with pity she couldn't bear to see. This morning felt different somehow, though Maya couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Perhaps it was the quality of light filtering through her small window, or the way the mountain air seemed to carry promises of change. She had learned not to trust such feelings, knowing that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. But something in the atmosphere of Pine Valley seemed charged with possibility. As she descended the narrow stairs that led from her apartment to the cafe's kitchen, Maya could hear Mrs. Patterson already bustling about, preparing for the breakfast rush. The older woman possessed an endless energy that belied her age, arriving at the cafe before 5 each morning, to begin the day's baking and staying until well after the dinner crowd had dispersed. "Morning, sweetheart," Mrs. Patterson called without looking up from the industrial mixer where she was preparing biscuit dough. "Sleep well." Maya had long since stopped pretending that she slept well, knowing that the dark circles under her eyes and the way she startled at unexpected sounds made such pretense pointless. "Well enough," she replied, tying her apron around her waist and checking that the dining room was ready for customers. The cafe's interior reflected the practical sensibilities of a mountain community, with sturdy wooden tables that had weathered decades of use, mismatched chairs that had been collected over the years, and walls decorated with local art. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Work and photographs that told the story of Pine Valley's history. The large windows that faced Main Street provided an excellent view of the town's daily activities. From the mail truck making its rounds to children walking to school with backpacks nearly as large as they were. Maya moved through the familiar routine of setting up for the day, checking that salt and pepper shakers were filled, napkin dispensers stocked, and the coffee machines ready to produce the steady stream of caffeine that kept Pine Valley functioning. She had discovered that routine was her salvation, providing structure and purpose that helped keep the darker thoughts at bay. The first customers began arriving shortly after 6, mostly ranchers and construction workers who needed substantial breakfasts before heading out to physically demanding jobs. Maya had learned the preferences of most regulars, knowing without being told that old Pete wanted his eggs over easy with wheat toast, that Sally from the post office preferred her coffee with 2 sugars and no cream, and that the Henderson brothers always split a stack of pancakes while arguing about everything from weather patterns to local politics. As the morning rush intensified, Maya found herself moving with practiced efficiency between tables, taking orders, delivering food, and refilling coffee cups with the kind of attentiveness that had made her a favorite among the cafe's regular customers. She might not engage in lengthy conversations, but she remembered details, anticipated needs, and never made anyone feel rushed or unwelcome. It was during this busy period that the bell above the front door chimed, signaling another arrival. Maya glanced up from the order she was taking, her polite smile already in place, only to feel her breath catch in her throat at the sight of the man ducking through the doorway. David Mitchell, known to everyone in Pine Valley as Bear, stood well over 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to span the width of the door frame. His presence filled the entire cafe, not through intimidation, but through a kind of gentle gravity that drew attention despite his obvious attempts to remain unobtrusive. His hair was dark brown with premature threads of silver at the temples, and his face, while undeniably handsome, bore the kind of weathered lines that spoke of someone who had faced significant hardships. Maya had seen Bear around town during her 6 months in Pine Valley, always from a distance, always moving with careful deliberation, as if he were constantly aware of his size and its potential to intimidate others. She had heard the stories, whispered conversations about the Mitchell family's animal sanctuary, About Bear's reputation for being able to calm the most traumatized creatures. About his gentle nature that contrasted so dramatically with his imposing physical presence. What struck Maya most forcefully was the way Bear carried himself, with a careful gentleness that suggested someone who had learned to be mindful of his impact on the world around him. His hands, which could easily span the width of dinner plates, moved with surprising delicacy as he removed his well-worn baseball cap and ran his fingers through his hair. His clothing was practical and clean, but showed the signs of someone who worked with animals, with small tears in his flannel shirt and dust on his boots that spoke of early morning chores. Bear's eyes, Maya noticed with a start, were the color of storm clouds, gray-blue and filled with a depth of understanding that made her feel as if he could see directly into her soul. When those eyes met hers across the crowded cafe, something passed between them. A recognition of shared pain that neither had expected to find in another person. The moment stretched longer than it should have, with Maya standing frozen beside a table of ranchers who were still waiting for her to finish taking their order. Bear seemed equally affected, his usual confident movement replaced by an almost shy hesitation as he searched for an empty table in the crowded dining room. "Maya, honey, could you seat Mr. Mitchell, Mrs. Patterson called from behind the counter, her voice carrying a note of knowing amusement that suggested she had noticed the silent exchange between her waitress and the gentle giant standing uncertainly in the doorway. Maya nodded, grateful for the excuse to approach him despite the way her heart was racing. "Good morning," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Table for one." Bear's voice when he spoke was exactly what she had expected, and yet somehow more. Deep and resonant, like distant thunder or wind through mountain pines, but soft enough that she had to lean slightly closer to hear him over the cafe's ambient noise. "Yes, please. Somewhere quiet, if possible." Maya led him to a corner table near the back of the cafe, one that would give him a good view of the room while providing some distance from the busiest sections. As she set down the menu and filled his coffee cup, she was acutely aware of his size. The way he had to fold his large frame carefully into the chair. How he kept his movements deliberately slow and controlled. "I'll give you a few minutes to look over the menu," Maya said, falling back on professional routine to cover her nervousness. "Thank you," Bear replied, and there was something in his tone that made the simple words feel like much more than polite acknowledgement. As Maya returned to her other tables, she found herself hyper-aware of Bear's presence in the corner. She could feel his eyes following her movements, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but with a kind of gentle attention that she hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember. When she approached other customers, she caught herself wondering what he might be thinking, whether he was judging her efficiency, or noticing the careful way she maintained professional distance from everyone around her. When she finally returned to take his order, Bear looked up from the menu with what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Mrs. Patterson's pancakes come highly recommended," he said, his voice carrying a hint of warmth that transformed his entire face. "They're definitely popular," Maya agreed, surprised by how natural the conversation felt, despite her usual discomfort with customers she didn't know well. "The blueberry ones are my personal favorite." "Then that's what I'll have," Bear decided, closing the menu and handing it back to her. "And maybe some insight into what brings someone new to Pine Valley. I don't think we've been properly introduced." The question was asked so gently, with such obvious respect for her boundaries, that Maya found herself more tempted to answer honestly than she had been in months. "I'm Maya Thompson," she said, then hesitated before adding, "I've been working here for about 6 months. "David Mitchell," he replied, extending one massive hand in greeting. "Most people call me Bear. I run the animal sanctuary just outside town." Maya shook his hand, surprised by the gentleness of his grip despite its obvious strength. His skin was warm and calloused from hard work, but he held her smaller hand as if it were made of delicate glass. "I've heard about your sanctuary," she said. "People speak very highly of what you do there." Something shifted in Bear's expression, a shadow of pain that flickered across his features before being carefully suppressed. We try to help animals that have been hurt or abandoned, he said simply. Sometimes healing takes time, but most creatures are stronger than they know. The words seemed to carry weight beyond their literal meaning, and Maya found herself studying his face with new interest. There was a story there, she realized, layers of experience that had shaped him into someone who understood trauma in ways that went beyond academic knowledge. I should get your order to the kitchen, Maya said, suddenly aware that she had been standing beside his table longer than strictly professional. Of course, Bear agreed, but his eyes remained fixed on hers. Thank you, Maya. The way he said her name, with careful pronunciation and gentle emphasis, made something warm unfurl in her chest. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her with such simple kindness, without expecting anything in return, or looking for signs of the damage she tried so hard to hide. As Maya walked toward the kitchen, she could feel Bear's gaze following her, not intrusive or demanding, but present in a way that made her feel seen rather than observed. It was a distinction she hadn't known existed until this moment. The difference between being watched and being truly noticed by someone who understood the value of gentle attention. Part 2. World Building and Context. The Mitchell Animal Sanctuary sat on 200 acres of pristine Colorado wilderness, where damaged souls, both human and animal, found refuge from a world that had proven too harsh for their tender spirits. The property had been in Bear's family for 3 generations. Originally established as a working cattle ranch by his grandfather in the 1940s. Over the decades, it had evolved into something entirely different, transformed by necessity and compassion into a haven for creatures that society had deemed too broken to save. Bear's grandfather, Samuel Mitchell, had been a man of few words but infinite patience, qualities that had served him well during the harsh winters and unpredictable market fluctuations that defined ranching life in the Colorado mountains. When Bear's father, Thomas, inherited the property in the 1980s, he had continued the family tradition until a series of devastating losses forced him to consider alternative uses for the land. The transformation began slowly, almost accidentally, when Thomas started taking in injured wildlife that hunters and hikers brought to the ranch. His natural gift for animal husbandry extended beyond cattle to encompass everything from orphaned deer to wounded birds of prey. Word spread throughout the region about the Mitchell Ranch becoming an unofficial wildlife rehabilitation center, and soon Thomas found himself caring for a menagerie of creatures that had nowhere else to go. Bear had grown up surrounded by this constant parade of healing animals, learning to read their body language and understand their needs in ways that seemed almost mystical to outside observers. His childhood was measured not in typical milestones, but in successful releases back to the wild, in animals that learned to trust again despite their traumatic experiences, in the quiet satisfaction of watching a creature that had arrived broken and afraid eventually regain its natural confidence. The mountains that surrounded the sanctuary created a natural barrier between this world of healing and the outside pressures that drove both animals and humans to seek refuge. Pine Valley itself existed in a kind of time warp, where progress moved slowly and community bonds remained strong, despite economic hardships that had forced many smaller towns to simply disappear from the map. The local economy depended heavily on tourism during the summer months, when city dwellers came seeking the authentic mountain experiences and outdoor adventures. During these busy seasons, the cafe where Maya worked became a hub of activity, serving visitors who wanted to experience genuine small-town hospitality, alongside locals who had learned to tolerate the temporary invasion with good humor. Winter told a different story entirely. When snow blocked many of the mountain passes, and temperatures dropped below zero for weeks at a time, Pine Valley became isolated from the outside world. During these months, the community turned inward, relying on neighbors for everything from medical emergencies to entertainment. It was during winter that the true character of the town revealed itself, when superficial politeness gave way to genuine care and mutual dependence. The sanctuary operated year-round, providing crucial services that extended far beyond simple animal care. Bear had gradually expanded the facility to include educational programs for school children, therapy sessions for troubled youth, and rehabilitation services for domestic animals that had been abused or neglected. The work required not only extensive knowledge of animal behavior and veterinary medicine, but also an understanding of human psychology that came from years of witnessing how trauma affected all living creatures. Maya had arrived in Pine Valley during the transition between autumn and winter, when the tourist season was winding down and the town was preparing for its annual hibernation. She had chosen this timing deliberately, hoping that the reduced activity would allow her to blend into the background more easily. What she hadn't anticipated was how the approaching winter would intensify the sense of community, making her attempts at invisibility increasingly difficult to maintain. Mrs. Patterson's cafe served as the unofficial town hall during the winter months. The place where decisions were made about everything from snow removal schedules to which families might need extra help getting through the harsh season. Maya found herself privy to conversations about unemployment, domestic disputes, and financial struggles that reminded her uncomfortably of her own recent experiences with poverty and desperation. The economic reality of modern ranching had forced many families to seek alternative sources of income. Some had converted their properties into guest ranches or hunting lodges. Others had sold their land to developers who promised to preserve the rural character while building vacation homes for wealthy urbanites. A few, like the Mitchell family, had found ways to adapt their traditional skills to serve new purposes while maintaining their connection to the land. Bear's Sanctuary operated on a combination of private donations, grants from wildlife conservation organizations, and fees charged for educational programs and therapy services. The financial model was precarious, requiring constant attention to maintain the delicate balance between meeting operating expenses and providing quality care for the animals that depended on the facility. The work was physically demanding and emotionally exhausting, requiring Bear to serve simultaneously as veterinary assistant, heavy equipment operator, fundraiser, and grief counselor for both animals and the humans who brought them to the sanctuary. He employed 3 full-time staff members and relied on a network of volunteers who helped with everything from feeding schedules to facility maintenance. Maya had heard fragments of conversation about the sanctuary during her months at the cafe, enough to understand that Bear's reputation extended far beyond Pine Valley. Wildlife rehabilitation specialists from across the region sought his advice on difficult cases. Veterinary schools sent students to observe his techniques. Animal behaviorists published papers based on methods he had developed through intuition and experience rather than formal training. Despite this recognition, Bear maintained a deliberately low profile in the community, participating in local events when his presence was specifically needed, but generally preferring the solitude of his mountain sanctuary to the social obligations of town life. His rare appearances at the cafe had always been brief, utilitarian visits focused on picking up supplies or meeting with potential donors rather than social interaction. This morning's visit felt different to Maya, though she couldn't articulate exactly how. There was something in Bear's manner that suggested he had come seeking more than just breakfast, though what that might be remained unclear. The careful way he had chosen his words, the gentle attention he had paid to her responses, the overall sense that he was evaluating not just the quality of the food, but the character of the person serving it. Pine Valley's residents had learned to be protective of their own, particularly when it came to newcomers who might be running from troubling circumstances. Maya's obvious reluctance to discuss her past had initially raised concerns among some community members, but her consistent work ethic and respectful demeanor had gradually won acceptance from most quarters. Mrs. Patterson had become something of a surrogate mother to Maya, providing not just employment and housing, but also the kind of steady, undemanding support that allowed healing to begin. The older woman possessed an intuitive understanding of when to offer advice and when to simply provide presence, skills developed through decades of serving a community where everyone knew everyone else's business, but had learned to respect necessary boundaries. The cafe itself reflected this delicate balance between openness and privacy. Conversations flowed freely about topics that affected the entire community, from weather patterns to local politics, to concerns about young people leaving for opportunities in larger cities. Personal matters were discussed more carefully, with an understanding that some subjects required invitation rather than casual inquiry. Maya had observed these social dynamics with the wariness of someone who had learned to recognize potential threats in everyday interactions. She had seen how quickly acceptance could turn to suspicion, how easily kindness could transform into manipulation. Her experiences had taught her to value the rare individuals who offered help without expecting anything in return, who respected boundaries without questioning their necessity. Bear's presence in the cafe that morning represented something new in Maya's carefully ordered existence, a disruption that felt simultaneously threatening and promising. His obvious strength could be intimidating, but the gentle way he moved and spoke suggested someone who had learned to use that strength in service of protection rather than domination. As Maya moved between tables during the breakfast rush, she found herself stealing glances toward the corner where Bear sat reading a local newspaper while waiting for his food. There was something almost meditative about his stillness, the way he seemed completely comfortable occupying space without feeling the need to fill it with unnecessary movement or noise. The other customers in the cafe seemed to give him a wider berth than usual, not from fear but from respect for his obvious preference for solitude. Maya noticed how children playing near his table automatically lowered their voices, how conversations at nearby tables became more subdued, as if his presence reminded everyone of the value of quiet contemplation. When Maya finally delivered his order of blueberry pancakes, Bear looked up from his newspaper with what might have been relief. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying the same gentle warmth she had noticed earlier. "These look perfect." "Mrs. Patterson takes pride in her breakfast menu," Maya replied, refilling his coffee cup with automatic efficiency. "She's been perfecting those recipes for 30 years. 30 years in the same place," Bear mused, cutting into the stack of pancakes with careful precision. "That's something rare these days." Maya found herself lingering beside his table despite the busy pace of the morning rush. "You've been here your whole life too, haven't you?" Bear nodded, chewing thoughtfully before responding. "Born and raised on the mountain. My family's land borders the national forest, so I grew up thinking the whole world was made of pine trees and granite peaks." "Do you ever think about leaving?" Maya asked, then immediately regretted the question as too personal for someone she had just met. If Bear found the question inappropriate, he didn't show it. Instead, he considered it seriously before answering. "I used to. When I was younger, I thought there had to be more exciting places, bigger opportunities somewhere else." He paused, taking another bite of pancakes. "Then I learned that some kinds of work can only be done in certain places. The animals I care for need space and quiet. They need to be far enough from human activity to heal properly." There was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't talking only about animals, and Maya felt a flutter of recognition in her chest. The sanctuary must be a lot of work for one person. "I have help," Bear replied. "Good people who understand what we're trying to accomplish. But you're right that it's demanding. Worth it though when you see an animal learn to trust again after being hurt." The word trust hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Maya wasn't sure she was ready to explore. She glanced around the cafe, noting that other customers were beginning to look expectant about their own service needs. "I should let you enjoy your breakfast," Maya said, taking a step back from the table. "Maya," Bear called softly as she turned away. When she looked back, his storm-gray eyes were fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "If you ever want to see the sanctuary, you're welcome to visit." Sometimes it helps to be around other creatures who are learning to heal. The invitation was offered so casually, with such obvious sincerity, that Maya felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She nodded once, not trusting her voice to remain steady, then hurried away to check on her other tables. Part 3. Protagonist Introduction. Maya's life had been defined by careful routines long before she arrived in Pine Valley. But the structured simplicity of mountain living had refined these habits into something approaching art. Each morning followed the same precise pattern: wake at 5:30, shower quickly in the shared bathroom down the hall, dress in the clean uniform she had prepared the night before, then descend to the cafe kitchen where Mrs. Patterson was always already bustling about with the kind of energy that seemed to draw power directly from the mountain air. The uniforms themselves were a comfort to Maya, simple black pants and white button-down shirts that allowed her to blend seamlessly into the background of cafe life. She had learned during her difficult years before Pine Valley that visibility often meant vulnerability, that drawing attention led to questions she couldn't answer and expectations she couldn't meet. The neutral clothing helped her maintain the careful invisibility that had become essential to her survival. Her apartment above the cafe was spartanly furnished by choice rather than necessity. Mrs. Patterson had offered to provide additional furniture, decorative items, anything that might make the space more homelike, but Maya had politely declined each offer. The bare walls and minimal possessions allowed her to maintain the illusion that her presence in Pine Valley was temporary, that she could leave at a moment's notice if circumstances required such a departure. The only personal items Maya allowed herself were practical ones: a small collection of books borrowed from the town library, all of which were carefully returned before their due dates, a basic sewing kit for maintaining her work clothes, toiletries purchased in the smallest possible quantities from the local general store. The most valuable item in her possession was the leather journal hidden beneath her mattress, but even that served a utilitarian purpose rather than sentimental value. Writing in the journal had become Maya's primary method of processing the traumatic experiences that had driven her to seek refuge in the mountains. Each night, after the cafe had closed and the last customer had departed, she would retrieve the worn leather book and carefully document her thoughts, fears, and observations. The act of translating her internal chaos into written words provided a sense of control that had been missing from her life for far too long. Maya's handwriting filled the journal's pages with meticulous precision, each letter formed with the kind of careful attention that revealed a mind seeking order in the midst of overwhelming uncertainty. She wrote about her work at the cafe, describing regular customers and their habits with the detached observation of an anthropologist studying an unfamiliar culture. She wrote about the changing seasons in the mountains, noting how the shifting light and weather patterns affected both the landscape and the community's rhythms. Most importantly, she wrote about her progress toward what she hoped might eventually become healing. Each small victory was recorded: a day without nightmares, a conversation with Mrs. Patterson that felt genuinely comfortable, a moment when the mountain scenery actually brought pleasure rather than simply serving as backdrop for her exile. These incremental improvements were fragile and easily disrupted, but documenting them helped Maya recognize that forward movement was possible even when progress felt imperceptible. The trauma that had driven Maya to Pine Valley remained largely unexamined in her conscious thoughts, pushed into mental compartments that she could ignore during daylight hours. She had become expert at redirecting her attention when memories threatened to surface, focusing intensely on immediate tasks until the danger passed. This strategy worked reasonably well during busy periods at the cafe, when the demands of customer service required her full attention, but quiet moments remained treacherous territory, where unwelcome thoughts could ambush her without warning. Maya's relationship with sleep had been complicated since long before her arrival in the mountains. The nightmares that plagued her unconscious hours were vivid enough to leave physical symptoms: racing heart, cold sweats, the kind of breathless panic that made her feel as if she were drowning in her own bed. She had learned to manage these episodes through breathing exercises and grounding techniques, discovered through desperate internet searches during the worst periods of her recent past. The mountain environment seemed to help somewhat with the sleep difficulties. The thin air at elevation required adjustment, but once her body adapted, Maya found that physical exhaustion from the demanding pace of cafe work helped quiet her mind during evening hours. The absence of city noises created a different kind of silence, one filled with natural sounds that felt soothing rather than threatening. Mrs. Patterson had never directly asked about Maya's obviously troubled sleep patterns, but the older woman's maternal instincts had led to subtle accommodations that made life easier for her young employee. The apartment's windows faced east toward the sunrise rather than west toward the town's modest nightlife. The walls were thick enough to muffle most sounds from the cafe below. Most thoughtfully, Mrs. Patterson had installed blackout curtains that allowed Maya to sleep later on her days off without being awakened by the intense mountain sunlight. Work at the cafe provided Maya with structure and purpose that had been missing from her life during the chaotic period before her arrival in Pine Valley. The predictable rhythm of breakfast rush, mid-morning lull, lunch crowd, and dinner service created a framework within which she could function effectively despite her internal struggles. Customer service, while emotionally draining, also offered opportunities to practice social interaction in controlled circumstances where professional boundaries provided necessary protection. Maya had discovered that she possessed natural instincts for hospitality that surprised both her and Mrs. Patterson. Despite her personal difficulties with trust and intimacy, she could anticipate customer needs, remember preferences, and provide the kind of attentive service that made people feel genuinely cared for. This ability seemed to emerge from some deeper part of her personality that trauma hadn't managed to damage completely. The regular customers had gradually accepted Maya as part of the cafe's atmosphere, treating her with the kind of casual kindness that mountain communities extended to their own. Old Pete always asked about her health when she served his morning coffee. Sally from the post office brought interesting mail stories to share during slow periods. The Henderson brothers had started including her in their good-natured arguments about everything from weather patterns to local politics, seeking her opinion as if her input actually mattered to the resolution of their disputes. These interactions remained carefully bounded by Maya's need for emotional safety, but they represented significant progress from the complete isolation she had maintained during her first weeks in Pine Valley. She was learning to distinguish between genuine friendliness and the kind of predatory attention that had taught her to fear human contact. The distinction wasn't always clear, but the overall atmosphere of the cafe felt safe enough to allow gradual experimentation with social connection. Maya's physical appearance had changed dramatically during her months in Pine Valley, though she remained largely unaware of the transformation. The constant low-level stress that had defined her previous existence had given way to a different kind of tension, one that allowed for proper rest and nutrition. Her auburn hair had regained its natural luster, and the hollow appearance around her eyes had softened into something approaching normal fatigue rather than exhaustion. The mountain climate had also affected her complexion, bringing color to cheeks that had been pale from too much time spent indoors hiding from various threats. Physical work at the cafe had built strength in arms and legs that had grown weak during periods when leaving her previous living situations felt too dangerous to risk. These changes were subtle but significant, representing a body that was beginning to trust its environment enough to invest in physical well-being. Maya's clothing choices reflected her continued need for invisibility and quick mobility, but even these practical considerations had evolved to accommodate her new circumstances. The clothes she wore now were clean, properly fitted, and maintained with care rather than simply functional. She had learned to take pride in her appearance again, not for the attention it might attract, but for the sense of self-respect that came with presenting herself well. The scarring on Maya's hands and arms told stories she refused to discuss with anyone in Pine Valley, but the marks were gradually becoming less prominent as time and mountain air promoted healing. She had developed habits of wearing long sleeves even in warm weather, not from shame but from a desire to control how much of her history remained visible to casual observation. The scars were part of her story, but not the part she was ready to share with others. Financial security remained precarious for Maya, but Mrs. Patterson's employment offer had provided the first stable income she had experienced in over 2 years. The combination of wages and free housing allowed her to begin building a small emergency fund, something that felt revolutionary after so many months of day-to-day survival. Having money in the bank, even a modest amount, represented freedom and options that she had almost forgotten were possible. Maya's relationship with food had also improved dramatically since arriving in Pine Valley. Regular access to nutritious meals, combined with Mrs. Patterson's maternal insistence on ensuring her employee ate properly, had begun to repair damage from extended periods of uncertainty about where the next meal might come from. The cafe's kitchen became a place of abundance rather than scarcity, where Maya learned to cook simple meals for herself, and even began to rediscover pleasure in the act of eating. The mountain community's attitude toward newcomers was generally welcoming but respectfully distant, allowing Maya the space she needed to adjust without pressure to participate in social activities before she felt ready. Church groups and community organizations had extended invitations that she could decline without giving offense. Neighbors offered help with practical matters while respecting her obvious need for privacy. This balance between inclusion and independence felt like exactly what Maya needed for gradual healing. Education had always been important to Maya, even during the worst periods of her recent past, and Pine Valley's small public library had become one of her favorite refuges during off-hours from the cafe. The librarian, an elderly man named Mr. Rodriguez, who had retired to the mountains after a career in Denver's school system, had quietly guided Maya toward books that might provide both entertainment and perspective on recovery from trauma. The reading material Maya chose reflected her hunger for stories about resilience and transformation, though she gravitated toward fiction rather than self-help books that felt too directly relevant to her circumstances. She particularly enjoyed novels about characters who rebuilt their lives after catastrophic losses, finding in these fictional journeys a kind of roadmap for her own tentative progress toward healing. Maya's daily routine at the cafe had evolved to include small acts of creativity and personal expression that would have been impossible during the darkest periods of her past. She had begun suggesting menu modifications to Mrs. Patterson, drawing on half-remembered cooking knowledge from earlier, happier times in her life. She had started arranging flowers from the cafe's small garden in ways that brought beauty to the dining room. These tiny contributions to her environment represented a growing sense of belonging that surprised her with its intensity. The 6 months Maya had spent in Pine Valley felt simultaneously like a lifetime and an instant, marking the longest period of stability she had experienced since her world had collapsed into chaos and violence. The mountain setting had provided exactly the kind of refuge she needed, remote enough to feel safe from pursuit, small enough to avoid anonymity that might hide threats, beautiful enough to offer daily reminders that the world contained wonder as well as cruelty. Part 4. Conflict Pressure Setup. The first signs of trouble arrived in Pine Valley on a Tuesday morning in late March, when the last of winter's snow was finally beginning to melt and reveal the dormant life waiting beneath its frozen blanket. Maya was working the early shift at Mountain View Cafe, moving between tables with her usual efficient grace, when she noticed Mrs. Patterson speaking in hushed, urgent tones with Dale Harrison, Pine Valley's part-time sheriff and full-time rancher. Dale's weathered face bore the kind of expression that mountain folk recognized immediately as serious trouble, the same look that preceded news about missing hikers, bear attacks, or the occasional domestic dispute that required official intervention. His presence at the cafe during morning hours was unusual enough to draw attention from several regular customers, who had learned over the years that Dale only sought public conversations when community-wide concerns needed to be addressed. Maya couldn't hear the specifics of their conversation from her position near the coffee station, but something in Mrs. Patterson's body language triggered the hypervigilance that trauma had burned into her nervous system. The older woman's shoulders had tensed in the particular way that indicated stress rather than normal concern, and her hands moved restlessly as she spoke, touching her apron, adjusting already perfect place settings, performing the small displacement activities that revealed inner turmoil. The conversation concluded with Dale accepting a cup of coffee to go and Mrs. Patterson walking him to the door with the kind of careful politeness reserved for difficult situations requiring delicate handling. After the sheriff's departure, Mrs. Patterson stood motionless for several moments, staring through the cafe's front window at something Maya couldn't see from her current angle. "Everything all right?" Maya asked quietly, when Mrs. Patterson returned to the kitchen area, though part of her mind was already calculating distances to the rear exit and inventorying which of her few possessions upstairs were essential enough to warrant the risk of retrieval. Mrs. Patterson managed a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, just some concerns about suspicious activity in the area. Nothing for you to worry about, sweetheart." But the dismissal felt forced, and Maya's hard-won instincts for recognizing deception began sending warning signals that she couldn't ignore. The nature of the suspicious activity became clearer over the following days as fragments of conversation drifted through the cafe's dining room. A series of break-ins had occurred at isolated properties throughout the region, apparently targeting homes and businesses that seemed temporarily abandoned or minimally protected. The thieves showed unusual sophistication in their approach, disabling security systems and avoiding detection in ways that suggested professional experience rather than opportunistic crime. What made the situation particularly troubling for law enforcement was the apparent randomness of the targets. Some victims were wealthy vacation homeowners whose absence made their properties obvious choices for theft. Others were local families whose modest circumstances made them unlikely candidates for lucrative burglary. The only common factor seemed to be isolation, properties that could be approached and searched without immediate risk of discovery. Maya listened to these discussions with growing unease, recognizing patterns that felt uncomfortably familiar from her previous experiences with dangerous people who specialized in identifying and exploiting vulnerability. The methodical nature of the crimes, the careful reconnaissance that must have preceded each incident, the focus on isolated targets, all suggested organized criminal activity rather than random opportunism. Pine Valley's residents responded to the threat with typical mountain pragmatism, increasing security measures and communication networks while maintaining the fundamental trust that made their community function. Neighbors began checking on each other more frequently. Property owners installed additional lighting and improved locks. The volunteer fire department organized informal patrols that would provide extra eyes on remote areas during overnight hours. For Maya, however, the community's response felt inadequate against the kind of threat that her experiences had taught her to recognize and fear. The break-ins might seem random to local law enforcement, but she suspected they represented something more systematic, possibly a search pattern designed to locate specific individuals rather than simply valuable property. The thought that someone might be actively looking for her in Pine Valley sent Maya's carefully constructed sense of safety crashing down around her. She had chosen this remote location precisely because it seemed unlikely that anyone from her past would think to search for her in such an isolated mountain community. The possibility that her refuge had been discovered, or worse, that she had inadvertently led danger to people who had shown her nothing but kindness, filled her with a dread that made normal functioning increasingly difficult. Maya's sleep, already fragile, deteriorated rapidly as anxiety about the break-ins combined with older traumas to create a state of constant hypervigilance that left her exhausted during daylight hours. She found herself checking and rechecking the locks on her apartment door, positioning furniture to provide early warning of intrusion, and sleeping fully clothed with her few essential possessions, packed and ready for immediate departure. The journal hidden beneath her mattress became filled with contingency plans and worst-case scenarios as Maya attempted to prepare for every possible threat. She researched bus schedules and identified multiple escape routes from Pine Valley. She calculated how much money she would need to disappear again and began reducing her already minimal expenses to build resources for potential flight. Mrs. Patterson noticed the change in Maya's demeanor almost immediately, though she initially attributed it to general concern about community safety rather than specific personal fears. The older woman began making subtle adjustments to Maya's work schedule, assigning her to shifts that would keep her in the cafe during daylight hours when the building felt most secure, while finding excuses to have other staff handle evening duties that might require working alone. Maya's interactions with customers became increasingly strained as her ability to maintain the cheerful professional demeanor that had made her popular with cafe regulars deteriorated under the pressure of constant anxiety. She found herself scanning each new face that entered the dining room, searching for signs of recognition or threat. Her hands shook slightly when handling hot coffee, and her usually excellent memory for orders began failing under the cognitive load of maintaining perpetual alertness. The situation reached a crisis point during Maya's third week of escalating anxiety, when a stranger entered the cafe during the normally quiet mid-afternoon period. The man was unremarkable in most respects: average height and build, neutral clothing that could belong to any outdoor enthusiast visiting the mountains, polite manner that drew no particular attention from other customers. What triggered Maya's alarm was something indefinable about his presence, a quality of watchful assessment that reminded her powerfully of people from her past who had specialized in finding individuals who didn't want to be found. The stranger ordered coffee and a sandwich, paid in cash, and settled at a corner table with a clear view of both the dining room and the street outside. Maya managed to take his order and deliver his food without obvious signs of distress. But internally she was fighting full-scale panic as memories of previous encounters with similar individuals flooded back with traumatic intensity. The careful way he positioned himself, the systematic visual examination of the cafe's layout, the patient manner in which he ate while maintaining awareness of everyone around him, all suggested professional surveillance rather than casual dining. When the stranger asked casual questions about local attractions and the best roads for exploring the mountain areas, Maya's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. She excused herself to the kitchen, where Mrs. Patterson found her several minutes later, hyperventilating, behind the industrial dishwasher, her face pale and her hands trembling uncontrollably. "Maya, honey, what's wrong?" Mrs. Patterson asked, immediately moving to provide physical support as Maya struggled to remain upright. "Should I call Dr. Wells?" Maya wanted desperately to explain, to share the crushing weight of fear that was making normal breathing impossible, but the habits of secrecy and self-protection that had kept her alive during the worst periods of her past prevented her from forming coherent words. Instead, she could only shake her head and focus on the breathing exercises that had helped her through previous panic attacks. Mrs. Patterson stayed with Maya until the worst of the episode passed, offering quiet reassurance and practical support, without demanding explanations that Maya clearly couldn't provide. When Maya finally felt stable enough to return to work, the stranger had departed, leaving exact change and no indication of where he might be headed next. The incident marked a turning point in Maya's sense of security in Pine Valley, destroying the carefully constructed illusion that geographic isolation could provide permanent safety from a past that contained people skilled at finding those who preferred to remain hidden. The break-ins had been abstract threats that might or might not be connected to her personal history, but the appearance of someone who felt familiar in all the wrong ways made the danger feel immediate and specific. Maya's journal entries from this period reflected her growing certainty that discovery was inevitable, that her peaceful months in Pine Valley had been merely a temporary reprieve rather than a genuine escape. She began planning for immediate departure, researching transportation options and calculating how quickly she could liquidate her small savings into cash that would be harder to trace. The decision to leave felt simultaneously necessary and devastating, representing the loss of the first place Maya had felt even tentatively safe in over 2 years. Pine Valley had given her time to begin healing, purpose through her work at the cafe, and the first genuine kindness she had experienced from people who expected nothing in return. Abandoning these gifts felt like a betrayal of both herself and the community that had welcomed her. Mrs. Patterson's growing concern about Maya's deteriorating emotional state led to increasingly direct questions about what might be troubling her young employee. The older woman's maternal instincts had correctly identified that Maya's distress went far beyond normal worry about community safety. But Maya's inability to discuss her past made these well-intentioned conversations feel like additional pressure rather than support. The morning after the stranger's visit, Maya made the decision to give Mrs. Patterson notice of her intention to leave Pine Valley, though she struggled to provide explanations that would make sense without revealing details about her past that felt too dangerous to share. The conversation took place in the cafe's kitchen during the quiet period between breakfast and lunch rushes, when they could speak privately without interruption from customers or other staff. "I need to tell you something," Maya began, her voice barely steady enough to form words. "I think it might be time for me to move on from Pine Valley." Mrs. Patterson's face immediately showed the kind of concerned disappointment that Maya had been dreading. "Oh, sweetheart, is this about the break-ins? Because we can take extra precautions, make sure you feel safer." "It's not that simple," Maya replied, struggling to find words that would convey the urgency of her situation without revealing its true nature. "I just think it would be better for everyone if I found work somewhere else." The inadequacy of this explanation was obvious to both women, but Maya's visible distress prevented Mrs. Patterson from pressing for details that were clearly too painful to discuss. Instead, the older woman focused on practical concerns, asking about timing and whether Maya needed help finding new employment or housing arrangements. Maya's plan was to leave Pine Valley within the week, taking only what she could carry and traveling by bus to a destination she hadn't yet chosen. But that would be far enough away to provide temporary safety while she figured out her next steps. The plan felt familiar from previous escapes, though this time the leaving felt like losing something precious rather than simply fleeing danger. The weight of her decision to abandon the first real home she had found in years pressed down on Maya with crushing intensity. But the alternative of staying and potentially bringing danger to people who had shown her nothing but kindness felt even more unbearable. Pine Valley had given her a glimpse of what normal life might feel like, but her past had finally caught up with the present in ways that made such normalcy impossible to maintain. Part 5. Escalating Problems. Maya's last week in Pine Valley unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a natural disaster, each day bringing new evidence that her worst fears about discovery were materializing, despite her desperate hopes that the stranger's appearance had been coincidental. The systematic nature of what was happening became undeniable when Mrs. Rodriguez from the general store mentioned that someone had been asking detailed questions about recent newcomers to the community, specifically focusing on young women who might be working in local businesses. The inquiry had been handled carefully, with the questioner presenting himself as a private investigator, working on behalf of a family trying to locate a missing relative. He had provided business cards and references that appeared legitimate to casual inspection, speaking with the kind of professional authority that most people found convincing. Rodriguez had thought nothing of confirming that a young woman matching Maya's general description worked at Mountain View Cafe, information that now felt like a death sentence waiting to be carried out. Maya learned about this conversation through the informal communication network that kept Pine Valley's residents informed about community happenings. But by the time the information reached her, the damage was already done. Her carefully maintained anonymity had been compromised by well-meaning people who had no reason to suspect that providing basic information about their neighbors might endanger someone they cared about. The realization that her location was now known to whoever had been searching for her triggered a level of panic that made Maya's previous anxiety episodes seem manageable by comparison. Sleep became completely impossible as she spent nights listening for sounds that might indicate someone approaching her apartment. Every customer who entered the cafe became a potential threat requiring constant evaluation. The simple act of walking from the kitchen to the dining room felt like crossing a battlefield where danger could emerge from any direction. Maya's work performance deteriorated rapidly as the cognitive demands of maintaining hypervigilance made normal functioning increasingly difficult. She found herself forgetting orders, dropping dishes, and struggling to engage in the kind of friendly customer service that had previously come naturally. Mrs. Patterson watched these changes with growing alarm, correctly identifying them as symptoms of severe stress but unable to address problems that Maya couldn't or wouldn't explain. The situation escalated dramatically when Maya spotted the same stranger from the previous week parked across the street from the cafe during her Thursday morning shift. He made no attempt to enter the building or directly approach her, but his presence felt like a clear message that escape was no longer possible. The careful way he positioned his vehicle to maintain visual contact with both the cafe's front entrance and the alley that led to the rear exit suggested professional surveillance techniques designed to prevent flight. Maya's response to this confirmation of active pursuit was swift and desperate. During her lunch break, she climbed the stairs to her apartment and began packing the few possessions that were both essential and portable, abandoning everything else that might slow her escape or provide evidence of her intended destination. The process felt mechanically familiar from previous flights, but this time the leaving carried emotional weight that made each discarded item feel like a small death. The leather journal that had served as her primary tool for processing trauma throughout her months in Pine Valley posed a particular dilemma. Its pages contained detailed accounts of her gradual healing, her growing affection for the mountain community, and her tentative hope that stable life might be possible again. Taking it would provide continuity with this important period of recovery, but it would also create evidence that could be used to track her future movements if discovered by the wrong people. Maya ultimately decided to leave the journal behind, carefully hiding it inside the loose floorboard beneath her bed where Mrs. Patterson might eventually discover it and understand at least some of what had driven her young employee to disappear without explanation. The decision felt like leaving part of her soul behind, but the risk of carrying such detailed personal information seemed too great when her survival depended on becoming invisible again. The plan was to slip away during the evening shift change when the cafe would be busy enough to mask her departure but not so crowded that her absence would be immediately noticed. Maya had already purchased a bus ticket under a false name, using identification documents that she had hoped never to need again but had maintained as insurance against exactly this kind of emergency. The next bus heading toward Denver would depart at 8:15, giving her just enough time to reach the station if she left the cafe at 7:30. Maya's final shift at Mountain View Cafe passed in a haze of suppressed emotion and mechanical efficiency as she struggled to maintain normal interactions with customers while internally saying goodbye to the life she had built in Pine Valley. Each familiar face felt like a small knife in her chest as she realized she would never again serve old Pete his morning coffee or listen to the Henderson brothers argue about weather patterns or receive Sally's latest postal service gossip. Mrs. Patterson seemed to sense that something momentous was happening, though she couldn't have known the specific nature of Maya's distress. The older woman found excuses to work beside Maya more closely than usual, offering the kind of steady, undemanding presence that had become a source of comfort throughout Maya's months of gradual healing. These small kindnesses made the impending betrayal of leaving without explanation feel even more cruel. The afternoon brought an unexpected complication when Bear Mitchell entered the cafe during the traditionally quiet period between lunch and dinner service. Maya hadn't seen him since their brief conversation several days earlier, but his presence now felt like a final test of her resolve to leave Pine Valley behind. Everything about his careful movements and gentle demeanor reminded her of what she was losing by fleeing, the possibility of human connection that didn't require constant vigilance against potential threats. Bear chose the same corner table he had occupied during his previous visit, settling his large frame into the chair with the same deliberate care Maya had noticed before. His storm gray eyes found hers immediately, and something in his expression suggested he had come seeking more than just coffee and conversation. There was an intensity in his gaze that made Maya feel as if he could see directly through her carefully maintained facade to the turmoil beneath. "Good afternoon," Maya managed, approaching his table with the professional smile that had become second nature during her months of customer service. "Coffee today, please," Bear replied, his deep voice carrying undertones that Maya couldn't quite identify. "And maybe a few minutes of your time if you can spare them." The request sent alarm bells ringing through Maya's nervous system, though she couldn't determine whether the danger came from Bear himself or from the possibility that their conversation might be observed by whoever was conducting surveillance on her activities. The stranger's vehicle remained parked across the street, its occupant maintaining the kind of patient watch that suggested professional experience with extended observation operations. Maya poured Bear's coffee with hands that trembled slightly despite her efforts to maintain steady control. "It's been pretty quiet this afternoon," she said, glancing around the nearly empty dining room. "Not much happening in Pine Valley today." Bear's eyes followed her gaze toward the window, and Maya wondered if he had noticed the surveillance vehicle or sensed the tension that seemed to permeate the normally peaceful atmosphere of the cafe. His next words suggested awareness that went beyond casual observation of his surroundings. "Sometimes quiet can be deceptive," Bear said carefully, his voice pitched low enough that it wouldn't carry beyond their immediate vicinity. "Animals learn to recognize when predators are near, even when everything appears calm on the surface." The comment hit Maya like a physical blow, confirming her suspicion that Bear possessed the kind of intuitive understanding that came from personal experience with danger and survival. His ability to read the subtle signs of her distress suggested either remarkable empathy or familiarity with situations where normal social interactions concealed more serious underlying threats. "I'm not sure what you mean," Maya replied, though her voice betrayed the lie even as she spoke it. Bear studied her face with the same patient intensity she had observed during their previous encounters, as if he were trying to decode a complex message written in a language he almost but didn't quite understand. "Maya, I've spent years working with animals that have been hurt by humans. I know what fear looks like, and I know what it means when someone is preparing to run." The accuracy of his assessment made Maya's breath catch in her throat. She glanced again toward the window, noting that the surveillance vehicle remained in position, its occupant undoubtedly monitoring everyone who entered or exited the cafe. The feeling of being trapped between known danger outside and potential threat inside created a level of panic that made rational thought increasingly difficult. "I don't know what you're talking about," Maya said, but the words sounded unconvincing even to her own ears. Bear leaned forward slightly, his massive hands wrapped around the coffee cup in a gesture that somehow managed to convey both strength and gentleness. "At the sanctuary, we see animals that have learned not to trust human intentions. They've been hurt so badly that kindness feels like a trap, safety feels like an illusion that will be snatched away without warning." Maya found herself nodding despite her attempts to maintain emotional distance from the conversation. Bear's description felt uncomfortably accurate, capturing the essence of her experience in ways that formal psychological terminology had never managed to achieve. "The thing about healing," Bear continued, his voice taking on the quality of someone sharing hard-won wisdom, "is that it requires taking risks that feel impossible when you've been conditioned to expect betrayal and abandonment. Some risks are too dangerous," Maya whispered, her carefully maintained professional demeanor finally cracking under the weight of accumulated stress and the unexpected relief of being understood by someone who didn't require detailed explanations. Bear nodded slowly, acknowledging the validity of her concern without dismissing the fear that drove it. "That's true, but sometimes the greatest danger comes from remaining isolated, from trying to face threats alone when help is available." Maya looked around the cafe, noting that Mrs. Patterson was busy in the kitchen and the few other customers were absorbed in their own conversations. The moment felt suspended in time, offering a brief opportunity for honesty that might not come again before her planned departure. "What if helping me puts other people in danger?" Maya asked, the question emerging from depths of guilt and terror that she had been carrying alone for months. Bear's expression softened with something that might have been recognition, as if her concern touched on experience from his own past that had taught him about the weight of responsibility for others' safety. "What if refusing help guarantees that everyone remains in danger?" The question reframed Maya's dilemma in ways she hadn't considered, suggesting possibilities beyond the simple choice between flight and remaining to face whatever threats were closing in around her. For the first time since spotting the surveillance vehicle, she allowed herself to consider alternatives to immediate escape. "I'm supposed to leave town tonight," Maya admitted, the words feeling like both confession and betrayal of her carefully maintained secrets. Bear's hands tightened almost imperceptibly around his coffee cup, the only visible sign of his reaction to this information. Where will you go? I don't know, Maya replied honestly. Somewhere far enough away that whoever is looking for me won't think to search. And then what? Bear asked gently. How long can you keep running before exhaustion makes you vulnerable to exactly the kind of capture you're trying to avoid? Maya had asked herself the same question during countless sleepless nights. Recognizing that her current strategy of geographic escape was ultimately unsustainable but unable to imagine alternatives that didn't involve unacceptable risks to her own safety or the well-being of innocent people who might get caught in whatever conflict was pursuing her. I don't have other options, Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper. Bear was quiet for several moments, apparently considering her situation with the same methodical attention he might bring to evaluating an injured animal's prospects for recovery. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of someone offering something precious and irreplaceable. What if you did have other options? What if there was a place where you could be safe while figuring out how to address whatever is chasing you? Maya's heart began racing with a combination of hope and terror that felt almost too intense to bear. The possibility of sanctuary felt too good to be true, the kind of gift that her experiences had taught her to suspect as either illusion or trap. Why would you help me? Maya asked, needing to understand his motivations before she could even consider accepting assistance that might prove more dangerous than the threats she was already facing. Bear's answer came without hesitation, suggesting that he had already considered this question thoroughly before making his offer. Because everyone deserves a chance to heal from whatever has hurt them. Because running away rarely solves problems that require standing and fighting. Because I recognize something in you that reminds me of animals I've helped recover from trauma. The comparison to wounded animals might have felt insulting from anyone else, but coming from Bear, it sounded like recognition of shared experience rather than condescension. Maya had observed enough about his work at the sanctuary to understand that he possessed genuine expertise in helping damaged creatures learn to trust again. What kind of place? Maya asked, allowing herself to imagine possibilities beyond immediate flight for the first time in days. The sanctuary sits on 200 acres of mountain wilderness. Bear explained, his voice taking on the proud tone of someone describing something deeply meaningful. It's isolated enough to provide security, but not so remote that help couldn't reach us if needed. The animals there have taught me a lot about creating environments where healing can happen safely. Maya glanced again toward the window, noting that the surveillance vehicle remained in position but that its occupant appeared to be focusing on the cafe's front entrance rather than monitoring individual conversations within the dining room. The realization that their discussion had gone unobserved provided a small measure of relief, though it didn't address the larger problem of being located by people who clearly intended her harm. There are people looking for me who won't give up easily, Maya warned, needing Bear to understand the potential consequences of offering her shelter. I don't know exactly what they want, but I know they're dangerous. Bear's expression grew more serious, acknowledging the gravity of her warning without showing signs of reconsidering his offer. The sanctuary has security measures designed to protect vulnerable animals from various threats. Many of the same precautions that keep predators away from injured wildlife would also provide protection for humans facing similar dangers. The practical tone of his response suggested that Bear had experience with security concerns that went beyond typical rural property protection. Though Maya couldn't determine whether this knowledge came from military background, law enforcement training, or simply the hard-earned wisdom of someone who had faced serious threats in the past. I need to think about this, Maya said, though part of her mind was already calculating how Bear's offer might provide alternatives to the bus ticket hidden in her apron pocket. Of course, Bear agreed, reaching into his wallet to leave money for his coffee. But Maya, whatever you decide, please don't make the choice based on fear alone. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is accept help from people who understand what we're going through. Bear rose from his chair with the same careful deliberation Maya had noticed during his previous visits, his height and breadth creating a momentary shadow that blocked the afternoon sunlight streaming through the cafe's windows. As he prepared to leave, he paused beside Maya's position at the table, his proximity close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his large frame. If you decide you want to see the sanctuary, follow Highway 36 north for about 12 miles until you reach the turnoff marked with a wooden sign that says Mitchell Wildlife Refuge. Bear said quietly. The road winds through the forest for another 3 miles before reaching the main buildings. I'll be there tonight, and I'll be watching for anyone who might need a safe place to figure out their next steps. With that invitation extended, Bear walked toward the cafe's front door, nodding politely to Mrs. Patterson as he passed through the kitchen area. Maya watched through the window as he climbed into a well-maintained pickup truck and drove away. Noting that the surveillance vehicle made no attempt to follow him but remained focused on monitoring the cafe itself. The afternoon passed with agonizing slowness as Maya struggled to weigh Bear's offer against the safety of her original escape plan. The bus ticket represented the familiar comfort of geographical distance, but Bear's sanctuary offered something she hadn't dared hope for. The possibility of addressing her problems rather than simply fleeing from them indefinitely. Mrs. Patterson seemed to sense the internal battle her young employee was fighting, offering gentle support without demanding explanations that Maya clearly couldn't provide. The older woman found excuses to work alongside Maya more closely than usual, creating opportunities for conversation that might provide comfort or clarity if Maya chose to seek them. As closing time approached, Maya realized that she was facing the most important decision of her adult life. The bus to Denver would depart in less than 2 hours, carrying her toward an uncertain future that held the promise of temporary safety but little hope for permanent resolution of the threats that had driven her into hiding. Alternatively, Bear's sanctuary offered the possibility of finding allies who might help her stand and fight rather than continuing to run from dangers that seemed to grow more determined with each passing day. The weight of choosing between these fundamentally different approaches to survival felt almost unbearable. But Maya recognized that indecision itself was a form of choice that would default to her original escape plan unless she actively decided to pursue Bear's alternative offer. As she untied her apron and prepared to leave Mountain View Cafe for what might be the final time, Maya caught sight of her reflection in the window and was startled by what she saw. Instead of the frightened victim she expected, she glimpsed someone who looked tired but not defeated, someone who had survived terrible experiences but retained enough strength to consider fighting back rather than simply running away. The image gave her courage she hadn't known she possessed, enough to make a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Maya folded her apron carefully and placed it on Mrs. Patterson's desk, then wrote a brief note explaining that she needed to take some time away but hoped to return soon. The words felt inadequate to express everything she wanted to say, but they represented the best compromise she could manage between honesty and necessity. Maya climbed the stairs to her apartment one final time, retrieving the small bag she had packed for her escape, but leaving behind the bus ticket that no longer represented her chosen path forward. Instead of heading toward the station, she walked to her battered used car, a vehicle she had avoided driving in recent weeks for fear that its license plates might be traced by people searching for her. The drive to Bear's sanctuary felt like a journey into unknown territory, both literally and metaphorically. Maya had never ventured far from Pine Valley during her months of residence, and the mountain roads leading to the Mitchell Wildlife Refuge wound through forests that seemed both beautiful and potentially threatening in the gathering dusk. As she followed Bear's directions along Highway 36, Maya found herself thinking about the animals at his sanctuary, creatures that had been hurt by humans but had somehow learned to trust again. The comparison felt both humbling and inspiring, suggesting that healing from trauma might be possible even for someone whose wounds felt too deep for recovery. The wooden sign marking the turnoff to Mitchell Wildlife Refuge appeared exactly where Bear had said it would, and Maya turned onto the narrow gravel road that led deeper into the mountain wilderness. The forest closed around her car like a protective embrace, filtering the last rays of sunlight through towering pine trees that had witnessed decades of seasons changing and life continuing despite whatever small dramas might unfold in their shadows. 3 miles later, Maya's headlights illuminated a collection of buildings that looked both rustic and well-maintained, structures that had been designed to blend harmoniously with their natural surroundings, while providing the practical facilities needed for caring for injured wildlife. Warm light glowed from several windows, and she could see Bear's familiar silhouette moving between what appeared to be animal enclosures, conducting evening rounds with the methodical care she had come to associate with his character. Maya parked her car near the main building and sat for several moments, gathering courage for whatever conversation was about to unfold. She had come this far based on instinct and desperation, but now she needed to find words to explain her situation to someone who had offered help without fully understanding what he might be taking on. Bear emerged from one of the enclosures carrying what appeared to be medical supplies, moving with the same deliberate care she had observed at the cafe, but now displaying the confident efficiency of someone working in familiar territory. When he spotted Maya's car, his pace quickened slightly, and she could see relief in his expression as he approached her vehicle. "I wasn't sure you would come," Bear said simply as Maya climbed out of her car, his deep voice carrying genuine warmth along with obvious concern for her well-being. "I wasn't sure either," Maya admitted, looking around at the sanctuary buildings and the mountain landscape that surrounded them. "But running away started to feel like giving up, and I'm not ready to do that yet." Bear smiled, and the expression transformed his weathered features in ways that made Maya understand why injured animals learned to trust him despite their previous experiences with human cruelty. "Good," he said, reaching for her bag with gentle insistence. "Let me show you around, and then we can figure out how to keep you safe while you decide what comes next." As they walked toward the main building, Maya felt something she hadn't experienced in over 2 years. The tentative beginnings of hope that her story might have chapters beyond survival and escape, that healing might be possible even for someone who had learned to expect betrayal and abandonment from every human connection. The sanctuary felt like stepping into a different world, one where strength was used to protect rather than dominate, where gentleness was a form of courage rather than weakness. For the first time since her arrival in Pine Valley, Maya allowed herself to imagine that she might have found not just temporary refuge but the beginning of a path toward reclaiming the life that trauma had stolen from her. The sanctuary's main building welcomed Maya with warmth that seemed to emanate from more than just the wood-burning stove crackling in the central living area. Bear guided her through rooms that felt both functional and comforting, spaces designed for practicality but softened by touches that spoke of someone who understood the importance of creating environments where healing could flourish. Handmade quilts draped over sturdy furniture, bookshelves lined with veterinary texts alongside classic literature, and photographs of successfully rehabilitated animals returning to the wild, created an atmosphere that balanced professional competence with genuine care. "The guest room is upstairs," Bear explained, leading Maya toward a staircase crafted from local timber that bore the marks of careful craftsmanship. "It's simple but comfortable, and the windows face east toward the sunrise. Many of the animals here seem to do better when they can see the light returning each morning." Maya followed him up the stairs, noting how the wooden steps barely creaked despite Bear's considerable size, evidence of construction built to last through mountain winters and the daily demands of caring for creatures that required stability and quiet. The guest room proved to be exactly as advertised. Simple furnishings including a bed with clean linens, a dresser, and a small desk positioned near windows that would indeed provide an excellent view of the dawn breaking over the mountain peaks. "The bathroom is across the hall," Bear continued, his tour maintaining the same gentle efficiency Maya had observed in his interactions at the cafe. "There are fresh towels in the closet, and the hot water heater is reliable even when the power goes out, which happens fairly regularly during winter storms." Maya set her small bag on the bed, struck by how different this arrival felt from her desperate flight to Pine Valley 6 months earlier. Then she had been running toward nothing more than geographical distance from danger.
Now, she was moving toward something that felt like possibility, though she couldn't yet articulate what that possibility might become. Thank you, Maya said, the words feeling inadequate to express her gratitude for Bear's willingness to offer shelter to someone whose problems remained largely mysterious to him. I know this is a risk for you, taking in someone you barely know. Bear paused in the doorway, his expression thoughtful as he considered how to respond to her concern. Every animal that comes here is a risk in some way. Wild creatures can be unpredictable when they're hurt and afraid. But I've learned that the greatest danger usually comes from abandoning someone who needs help, not from providing it. The comparison to his work with injured wildlife might have seemed patronizing from anyone else, but Bear's tone carried the respect of someone who had witnessed the courage required for healing from trauma. Maya sensed that his understanding came from personal experience as well as professional observation, though she couldn't yet determine the source of whatever pain had taught him such compassion. Would you like to see some of the animals before it gets too dark? Bear asked, his invitation carrying the enthusiasm of someone genuinely passionate about his work. Most of them are settling in for the evening, but a few are more active during twilight hours. Maya nodded eagerly, recognizing an
opportunity to understand more about the man who had offered her sanctuary and the work that had shaped his approach to helping damaged creatures recover their ability to trust. They descended the stairs and exited through a back door that led to a network of enclosures and facilities designed to accommodate animals with varying needs and stages of recovery. The first enclosure they visited housed a magnificent red-tailed hawk that had been brought to the sanctuary with a wing injury caused by collision with power lines. The bird perched on a specially designed platform that allowed it to maintain dignity while accommodating its temporary inability to fly, its keen eyes tracking their movement with alert intelligence that suggested full mental acuity despite physical limitations. Red Wing has been here for about 2 months, Bear explained, his voice dropping to the quieter tones appropriate for beings that might be startled by sudden sounds. The wing is healing well, but hawks need to rebuild flight muscles gradually, or they risk re-injury when they're released back to the wild. Maya watched as Bear performed what appeared to be a routine evening check, examining the hawk's posture and behavior for signs of distress or improvement. The bird remained calm during this inspection, suggesting a level of trust that must have developed over many weeks of consistent, gentle care. How do you know when they're ready to be released? Maya asked, fascinated by the delicate balance between providing necessary care and avoiding the kind of dependence that might prevent successful return to independence. They tell you, Bear replied simply. Wild animals have instincts that domestic creatures often lack. When Red Wing is ready to leave, she'll start showing signs of restlessness, testing her wings more frequently, looking toward the sky with a kind of longing that means she's remembering what it feels like to be free. The insight felt relevant to more than just wildlife rehabilitation, and Maya found herself wondering what signs might indicate her own readiness to move beyond the protective boundaries that had kept her alive, but limited her ability to truly live. Their tour continued through enclosures housing a variety of creatures in different stages of recovery. A family of orphaned fox kits tumbled over each other in playful wrestling matches that would teach them essential survival skills. An elderly deer with a permanently damaged leg had found contentment in a large paddock where she could graze peacefully without the stress of avoiding predators. A young bear cub, rescued after its mother was killed by poachers, slept peacefully in a den designed to mimic natural cave conditions. Each animal's story revealed aspects of Bear's character that helped Maya understand why she had instinctively trusted him, despite her learned wariness of human intentions. His approach to rehabilitation balanced practical medical care with emotional healing, recognizing that trauma affected not just physical bodies, but also the psychological foundations that enabled creatures to function successfully in their natural environments. The hardest part, Bear confided as they completed their circuit of the enclosures, is learning when to push for progress and when to simply provide patience. Some animals need encouragement to move beyond their fear, while others require time to process their experiences before they're ready to risk vulnerability again. Maya understood that he was talking about more than just animal psychology, and she felt a deep appreciation for his ability to communicate complex truths through simple observations about the creatures in his care. His wisdom seemed to come from years of witnessing healing happen at its own pace, guided by understanding, rather than forced by external expectations. As full darkness settled over the sanctuary, Bear led Maya back toward the main building, where he had prepared a simple dinner of soup and fresh bread that filled the kitchen with aromas that reminded Maya of the comfort food she had enjoyed during happier periods of her childhood. They ate by lamplight, the electricity having been turned low to avoid disturbing nocturnal animals that were beginning their evening activities. "Tell me about the people who are looking for you," Bear said gently, his request emerging naturally from their comfortable conversation rather than feeling like an interrogation. "Not the details that feel too dangerous to share, but enough so I can understand what kind of threats we might be facing." Maya had been dreading this conversation while simultaneously longing for the relief that might come from finally sharing the burden of her fear with someone who seemed capable of understanding its weight. She found herself able to speak more freely than she had in months, perhaps because Bear's work with traumatized animals had taught him to listen without judgment or premature attempts to offer solutions. "They're people who believe I have something that belongs to them," Maya began carefully, choosing words that would convey the seriousness of her situation without revealing details that might increase the danger to Bear or his sanctuary. "I witnessed something I wasn't supposed to see, and now they think I pose a threat to their business operations." Bear nodded thoughtfully, apparently understanding that business operations might encompass activities that operated outside legal boundaries. "Are these people likely to give up if they can't locate you immediately? Or are they the type who will keep searching until they find what they're looking for?" "They don't give up," Maya replied, her voice carrying the weight of months spent looking over her shoulder and jumping at unexpected sounds. "They have resources and connections that make staying hidden very difficult for very long." "What about law enforcement?" Bear asked. "Have you considered seeking official protection?" Maya's laugh carried no humor, only the bitter understanding of someone who had learned not to trust systems that were supposed to provide safety. "The people looking for me have friends in places that make official protection unreliable. I tried that approach once, and it nearly got me killed." Bear's expression grew more serious as he absorbed this information, and Maya could see him mentally adjusting his assessment of the situation from simple pursuit by dangerous individuals to something more complex and potentially more threatening. The knowledge that she was facing adversaries with institutional connections seemed to increase rather than diminish his determination to help her. "Then we'll need to be smarter than they are," Bear said matter-of-factly, as if facing such challenges was a routine part of sanctuary operations. "The advantage of this location is that there's only one road in or out, which makes surprise approaches difficult. The disadvantage is that the same geographical isolation that provides protection also limits escape routes if protection fails." Maya felt a chill at his casual reference to the possibility that protection might fail, but she also experienced unexpected relief at finally discussing her situation with someone who took its seriousness seriously, without being overwhelmed by its complexity. Bear's military bearing and systematic approach to security concerns suggested experience with dangerous situations that went beyond wildlife rehabilitation. "You seem to know a lot about this kind of thing," Maya observed, curious about the background that had prepared Bear for conversations about evasion tactics and defensive strategies. Bear was quiet for several moments, apparently deciding how much of his own story to reveal in exchange for Maya's trust. "I spent 8 years in the Army Rangers before coming back to run the sanctuary. 2 tours in Afghanistan taught me things about staying alive in hostile territory that have proved useful in civilian situations as well." The revelation explained much about Bear's calm competence in the face of potential threats, his ability to assess security vulnerabilities, and his understanding of how trauma affected both humans and animals. Maya felt her respect for him deepen as she realized that his offer of protection came from someone with genuine expertise in defensive operations rather than simply good intentions unsupported by practical skills. "Why did you leave the military?" Maya asked, sensing that Bear's transition from soldier to wildlife rehabilitator represented its own journey of healing from experiences that might have been as traumatic as her own. Bear's hands tightened almost imperceptibly around his coffee cup, the same subtle tension Maya had noticed when difficult subjects arose during their conversation at the cafe. "I lost my unit during our second deployment. IED attack that I should have prevented if I'd been paying closer attention to signs that were obvious in retrospect.
The pain in his voice was carefully controlled but unmistakable, revealing wounds that had clearly shaped his subsequent choices about how to use his skills and experience. Maya understood instinctively that Bear's work with injured animals represented a form of penance for perceived failures that continued to haunt him despite the passage of years. "How many people did you lose?" Maya asked softly, recognizing the importance of witnessing Bear's pain as he had witnessed hers. 12. Bear replied simply. "Good soldiers, most of them younger than I was, all of them counting on my leadership to bring them home safely." Maya reached across the table to cover Bear's large hand with her smaller one, offering the kind of human connection that her own trauma had taught her to value above almost everything else. "Survivor's guilt is a special kind of hell," she said quietly. "I know because I carry it too." Bear's eyes met hers across the table, and something passed between them that went beyond simple understanding. They were both people who had witnessed terrible things, who carried responsibility for outcomes they couldn't control, who had learned to function despite psychological wounds that would never fully heal. "Is that why you help animals?" Maya asked. "Because they don't blame you for things that weren't your fault." Bear smiled sadly, acknowledging the accuracy of her insight. "Animals are honest about their pain. They don't pretend to be unaffected by trauma, but they also don't hold grudges against people who try to help them heal. There's something clean about that honesty that makes redemption feel possible." Maya nodded, understanding how Bear's work at the sanctuary served purposes that went far beyond simple wildlife rehabilitation. The animals he cared for provided opportunities for successful rescue that helped balance the weight of rescues that had failed, creating meaning from experiences that might otherwise have been purely destructive. "What happens now?" Maya asked, gesturing toward the windows that looked out into mountain darkness where unknown threats might be gathering. "How long can I stay here before my presence puts you and the animals in danger?" Bear leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful as he considered options that Maya couldn't yet imagine. "That depends partly on how determined your pursuers are and partly on whether you're ready to stop running and start fighting back." The suggestion that fighting back might be possible felt both terrifying and exhilarating to Maya, who had spent so many months focused purely on escape and evasion that she had forgotten other responses to danger existed. The idea of taking active steps to address her situation rather than simply reacting to threats felt revolutionary. "I don't know how to fight people who have resources I can't match," Maya admitted, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had spent too long trying to solve impossible problems alone. "You don't fight them directly," Bear explained patiently. "You make the cost of pursuing you higher than the value of whatever they think you can provide. You create situations where leaving you alone becomes their best option." Maya felt a spark of hope at the suggestion that her situation might not be as hopeless as she had believed. "How do we do that?" Bear's smile carried the confidence of someone who had faced seemingly impossible tactical challenges and found ways to prevail through intelligence and careful planning. "First, we gather information about exactly who is looking for you and what they really want. Then we figure out how to give them something better than what they expect to gain by finding you." The strategy felt more sophisticated than simple hiding or running, requiring Maya to shift from reactive survival mode to proactive problem solving. The change in perspective felt both challenging and empowering, offering possibilities she hadn't considered during months of desperate flight. "Tomorrow we'll start making phone calls and doing research," Bear continued, his tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to planning complex operations. "I have contacts from my military service who specialize in gathering intelligence on criminal organizations. They owe me favors that I've never collected, and this seems like an appropriate time to call them in." Maya felt tears welling in her eyes as the full impact of Bear's commitment to helping her began to sink in. After months of facing her problems alone, the prospect of having an ally with genuine expertise felt almost too good to believe. "Why are you doing this for me?" Maya asked, needing to understand the motivations behind such extraordinary generosity. Bear's answer came without hesitation, suggesting that he had already considered this question thoroughly. "Because everyone deserves a chance to reclaim their life from people who want to destroy it. Because you remind me of the wounded animals that arrive here convinced they'll never be safe again, but who eventually learn that healing is possible with the right kind of support." The comparison to his rehabilitation work felt like recognition rather than condescension. Acknowledging Maya's strength while offering hope that recovery might be possible even from trauma that felt overwhelming. As they prepared for bed, Bear showed Maya the security measures he had installed throughout the sanctuary: motion sensors that would alert them to approaching vehicles, cameras that provided views of all access routes, and communication equipment that could summon help from law enforcement or military contacts if needed. The preparations felt thorough without being paranoid, representing the careful balance between reasonable precautions and excessive anxiety. "Try to get some sleep," Bear advised as they climbed the stairs toward their respective bedrooms. "Tomorrow we start taking your life back from people who have no right to control it." Maya settled into the comfortable bed in Bear's guest room, surrounded by the sounds of nocturnal animals going about their business in the forest surrounding the sanctuary. For the first time in months, she felt safe enough to allow her guard to drop completely, trusting that Bear's vigilance and security measures would provide protection while she rested. As sleep finally claimed her, Maya's last conscious thought was wonder at how much her situation had changed in a single day. This morning, she had been preparing to flee Pine Valley in another desperate attempt at geographical escape. Tonight, she was falling asleep in a place that felt like sanctuary in the truest sense, protected by someone who understood both the reality of her danger and the possibility that it might be overcome through intelligence, courage, and the kind of partnership that emerged when two damaged souls recognized their complementary strengths. The gentle giant who had offered her shelter possessed the physical presence to deter threats and the tactical knowledge to develop effective strategies. But perhaps most importantly, he had the patient wisdom to understand that healing happened gradually, at its own pace, guided by trust rather than forced by external pressure. Maya drifted toward sleep feeling, for the first time in years, that she might have found not just temporary refuge but the beginning of a path toward reclaiming the life that trauma had stolen from her. Dawn broke over the Colorado mountains with the kind of spectacular beauty that reminded observers why people chose to build lives in places where nature's magnificence compensated for isolation and hardship. Maya woke to sunlight streaming through the east-facing windows of her room, carrying warmth that seemed to penetrate deeper than just her skin to reach parts of her soul that had been cold for far too long. The sounds drifting through her open window spoke of a sanctuary coming to life. The contented murmuring of animals beginning their daily routines, the gentle movement of Bear performing morning rounds, the whisper of wind through pine trees that had witnessed countless cycles of healing and renewal. Maya dressed quickly and descended to find Bear already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with the same methodical care she had observed in all his activities. "Good morning," Bear said, his deep voice carrying warmth that felt like an embrace. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," Maya admitted, accepting the cup of coffee he offered with grateful hands. "Thank you for giving me a safe place to rest." Bear smiled, and Maya was struck again by how his expression transformed his weathered features, revealing gentleness that complemented rather than contradicted his obvious strength. Sleep is the foundation of healing. Animals understand this instinctively, but humans often need reminding that rest is not luxury but necessity. As they shared breakfast, Bear outlined his plans for gathering intelligence about Maya's pursuers, describing contacts and resources that could provide information while maintaining the security that would keep them both safe. His approach balanced careful investigation with protective measures, representing the kind of strategic thinking that offered hope for resolution rather than just temporary escape. Maya found herself able to share more details about her situation as Bear's questions helped her organize thoughts and memories that trauma had left fragmented and incomplete. The process of articulation felt therapeutic, transforming overwhelming fear into manageable problems that could be addressed through systematic planning and coordinated action. By mid-morning, Bear was making phone calls to former military colleagues who had transitioned into various forms of security consulting, describing Maya's situation in terms that conveyed its seriousness without compromising operational security. Maya listened to these conversations with amazement, witnessing the activation of a support network she hadn't known existed. People who shared bonds forged through shared danger and mutual dependence in combat situations. The information that emerged from these inquiries painted a clearer picture of the organization pursuing Maya, revealing weaknesses and internal conflicts that offered opportunities for the kind of strategic intervention Bear had described. Maya began to understand that her enemies, while dangerous and well-connected, were not invulnerable to pressure applied in the right places by people with appropriate skills and resources. As afternoon approached, Bear suggested they take a break from planning to visit the animals. Recognizing that healing required balance between addressing immediate threats and maintaining connection to sources of hope and renewal, Maya welcomed the opportunity to observe Bear's work more closely, understanding that his approach to wildlife rehabilitation might offer insights into her own recovery process. They spent the afternoon working together to care for the sanctuary's residents, Maya learning to assist with feeding schedules and basic medical care, while Bear shared stories about each animal's journey from injury through rehabilitation toward eventual release. The work felt both meaningful and meditative, providing respite from anxiety while building the kind of partnership that emerged when two people combined their strengths toward common purpose. You have natural instincts for this work, Bear observed as Maya successfully coaxed a nervous rabbit to accept medical treatment through patient, gentle persistence. Animals respond to authenticity, and they can sense that you understand what it means to be afraid. Maya felt pride at his recognition, understanding that Bear's praise came from someone whose opinion carried weight beyond simple encouragement. Her ability to help injured creatures represented progress in her own healing, evidence that trauma had not destroyed her capacity for compassion and effective action. As evening approached, Bear received a phone call that brought news both troubling and promising. His contacts had confirmed that Maya's pursuers were indeed searching systematically through mountain communities, but they had also identified leverage points that could be used to convince the organization that continued pursuit was not in their best interests. They want information you possess about financial irregularities that could expose their operation to federal investigation, Bear explained after ending his call. But they're also facing internal pressure from partners who think the search has become too expensive and too visible. Maya felt a mixture of fear and hope at this intelligence, recognizing both the continued danger she faced and the possibility that resolution might be achievable through negotiation rather than endless flight. What do we do with this information? Maya asked, trusting Bear's tactical judgment while knowing that any decisions about her future had to remain ultimately her own. Bear's answer revealed the depth of planning he had been conducting while she observed his animal care routine. We arrange a meeting under controlled conditions, where you can negotiate from a position of strength rather than weakness. You have something they want, and now we know they have reasons to prefer negotiation over continued pursuit. The prospect of facing her pursuers directly felt terrifying, but Maya recognized that Bear's strategy offered possibilities that endless running could never provide. With proper preparation and support, she might be able to reclaim control over her life rather than remaining perpetually reactive to external threats. As they prepared for what might be their final quiet evening before implementing Bear's plan, Maya realized that her story was approaching a turning point that would determine whether her future held continued flight or the possibility of genuine freedom. The gentle giant who had offered her sanctuary had also provided something more precious: the tactical knowledge and personal support that might enable her to transform from victim to survivor to someone capable of helping others facing similar challenges. Maya looked around the sanctuary that had become her refuge, watching injured animals going about their evening routines in the safety Bear had created for them, and understood that healing was indeed possible even from trauma that felt overwhelming. Tomorrow would bring risks and challenges that might determine the rest of her life, but tonight she could rest in the knowledge that she was no longer facing those challenges alone. The mountain darkness that settled over the sanctuary felt protective rather than threatening, wrapping Maya and Bear in the kind of peaceful solitude that allowed both planning and healing to flourish. As they sat together reviewing final preparations for the confrontation ahead, Maya understood that regardless of what tomorrow might bring, She had already reclaimed something essential that her pursuers had tried to destroy: the ability to trust another human being completely. And the knowledge that even the most broken pieces could indeed fit together to create something stronger than either fragment had ever been alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.